Welcome to the session on a side session actually run by civil society, organized by KTNC Watch, ESCR Net, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Manushya Foundation, the Asian Task Force for Legally Binding Instrument, Human Rights Now, INSAF, and ASEAN Burma. The NAPs, National Action Plans, Stocktaking, and charting the way ahead. We have quite a short amount of time and 5 speakers. By the way, in case you haven't noticed, I'm Debbie, your moderator. And I decided to crack the whip and make people speak and rap very short. So the three questions I'm going to ask our speakers in turn. And the reason I'm trying to get them to be as brief as possible is to make sure that since we are a rather intimate in-person group, you all have a chance to ask questions. Preferably focus on the topic and not challenging human rights as a concept. Okay, without further ado, firstly, if you were in any of the sessions, especially the plenary session yesterday and the civil society sessions, you would recognize that there is a great deal of skepticism of the efficacy and impact, the positive impact of national action plans. Since the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights is mainly a voluntary framework, and the UN Working Group was advocating for a smart mix of voluntary and mandatory elements to national action plans as a way of implementing the guiding principles on the ground, we from the Asia Pacific recognize that our governments, those who actually got together to do a national action plan, cherry-picked what they wanted a national action plan and made it very voluntary. And with the COVID pandemic crisis, the pressures on social protection and human rights in the region, we saw that we guidelines went out the window. So it's pretty clear that we are now heading into a situation where, as governments and corporations in our region fight to gain back all their economic losses, we are going to be basically in the middle of that crunch. We will be the meat in the sandwich because as they rush to regain all their economic losses, it's going to be at the cost of human rights, especially communities on the ground, vulnerable workers, and low wage and rural people. So, there is definitely a sense of urgency that something is required that will provide some mandatory protection, knowing that even in a mandatory regime, there's still going to be challenges around implementation, but it actually empowers actors, both nationally and regionally, to be able to use those mandatory tools for human rights protection. But that's where we're heading. And so when we talk about national action plans, stock taking, and charting the way forward, this is quite a euphemism, right? But we will have our speakers talk a little bit about national action plans as a starting point to understand why there is a sense of urgency around mandatory regimes. First up, I was going to ask 3 questions. So the first round of questions is, what's your biggest concern or criticism of a national action plan? And what's the burning issue that the NAP failed to address? And I know everyone's going to have a lot of things to say, so you're going to have to pick one burning issue. Okay? So Emily Palami Pradicit is the founder and executive director of Manushya Foundation. She's an intersectional feminist and international human rights lawyer. She actually was a co-founder of the Thai BHR network and sits on various boards, and more notably received the Leader by Head and Heart Award in May. Now, Emily, the Thai government adopted a national action plan in 2019. And startlingly, the national action plan had not much resemblance to the comprehensive recommendations made by very diverse and intersectional activists from all around the country. So if you were to say, if you were to actually have one point to focus on, what would be the burning issue when it comes to the Thai National Action Plan?
Thank you very much, Debbie. It's hard to just say one big issue because we are disappointed by many. For those who were at the forum yesterday, I'm sure you all saw when the Thai BHR network made a mini protest when we took the floor several times to share our disappointment with the Thai government. But basically, I would say the biggest disappointment was that we had a lot of hopes in the NAP. We were the first Asian countries to go through it, civil society in the region, especially Manushya Foundation and the Thai BHR network. We had a lot of hopes in NAPs. We thought that it would bring changes on the ground, that it would regulate business activities, but we were fooled. We were fooled because obviously we were used by the government, we were used by UNGP, who is championing NAPs in the region and championing the way that government should be developing NAPs. So all the work that we did with communities on the ground, all the capacity building that we did, all the meaningful consultation, because we had a very good process. We developed our own national baseline assessment. So we had a very good independent process because we really wanted to inform the government NAP as much as possible. We wanted to bring change. So all of our pictures, all of our work was used by UNDP and the government to showcase a very good NAP process. But as a result of that, we got a very weak content. So I would like to warn everybody who is working on apps, and I would like to warn all the civil society that are getting excited to work on app, or who are also being approached by UNDP to develop apps. I would like to ask you a question. Always follow, what do you follow? Do you follow your ego and you want to have the UNDP stamp? Or do you follow your heart and you want to follow the community concerns? Because if you want to follow the community concerns, when you have a good process, you have to make sure that the content is as good as the process. In our NAP, we had exclusion of key communities that were engaged in the process. Sex workers who heavily engaged in the NAP process were totally excluded. Indigenous people who heavily engaged in the process, and indigenous people were going to jail at the same time, were totally excluded from the NAP. The NAP content is totally weak. The government of Thailand did not follow the guidelines of the UN Working Group. They did not follow a good mix of mandatory and voluntary measures. As a result of that, we have a very weak NAP that is only full of voluntary measures, and actually it's not a real NAP. That's why we call it a napping document. It's only a work plan of meetings. So I don't think that we invest time and money, and believe us, we had to do a lot of fundraising to be able to do our MBA and to be able to train communities. And we had to bring in regional experts to train us as well. We have Debbie, we have Praveen also, indigenous representative to train us. So all that was not free. We invested a lot of time, a lot of money. Nobody was giving us money. No UN agency was giving us money because we believed in the process and we believe in the content. At the end of the day, we got a napping document. That's the very reason why since yesterday we are warning countries, we are warning civil society, we are warning everybody, we are telling everyone to stop napping. It's been 10 years of the UNGPs, and as a result of the 10 years of the UNGPs, if you really want a real implementation of the UNGPs, it's time to move to mandatory human rights due diligence, and it's time to move to lobby our governments in Asia to engage in the binding treaty. If we don't have mandatory human rights due diligence, if we don't have regulatory framework, we will never be able to hold companies into account. So please don't waste your time. There's no more time to do bad naps. That's why we say stop napping. And we really encourage everyone to join our movement to call for governments in the region to push for mandatory human rights due diligence and regulatory frameworks.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going to move on to Shin Swan's son, who originally started a career like me in the media and journalism, and then moved on to become a human rights researcher and campaigner. She was formerly with Covenant's Watch, but now is with the Environmental Rights Foundation of Taiwan. Now, Shin-Swan, Taiwan adopted some type of NAP in 2020. So what are your biggest concerns? What's the burning issue that makes you feel unhappy with this NAP?
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. And I'd like to just take a quick 10 seconds to thank this panel for having me and everyone here, because I can't stress enough how rare it is an opportunity for a voice from Taiwan to be heard and represented at a forum at this level. So thank you so much. Coming back to Debbie's question, so Taiwan, we launched our NAP in 2020. It's especially on VHR. But however, it has not brought about any policy or legislative changes, like Emily pointed out with Thailand. It's largely voluntary. There is no specific time frame for completion of actions, and the agency in charge of its implementation and monitoring does not have the resources and power to make actual influences within the government. So if I have to pick one, I would say the NAP failed to address the state's extraterritorial obligation to ensure Taiwanese businesses and investments protect and respect human rights and the environment abroad. And when harms happen, Taiwanese government should provide for effective remedy for foreign victims, including by taking the extra step to remove physical and legal barriers for these victims and plaintiffs. Now, the economy in Asia is a really tight network, and Taiwanese businesses play a really important role in a lot of global supply chains, including the semiconductor industry, the garment industry. So I believe it is not possible for Taiwan or the region as a whole to achieve its business and human rights agenda unless Taiwan's government takes seriously its extraterritorial obligations to protect and respect human rights overseas. Now, I want to give you a great example of a failed situation. That is the case of Formosa Plastics in Vietnam. Some of you might have heard of the case. So just briefly, in 2016, a steel plant owned by Formosa Plastics Group, which is the Taiwanese petrochemical conglomerate, and the China Steel Corporation, which is partially owned by the Taiwanese government, and a Japanese steel company. Anyways, the steel plant discharged wastewater and polluted the sea in central Vietnam. Tens of thousands of lives were impacted, and a protest demanding compensation and restoration of the environment was oppressed by the government. People who spoke up, who participated in the protest, peaceful demonstration, were beaten and jailed and sentenced by the Vietnamese government. So in 2019, which is 3 years after the incident, Taiwanese organizations filed a lawsuit in Taiwan on behalf of the victims. However, the problem is this case, it's been 7 years now, and this case has not entered substantial proceeding. And we spent 2 to 3 years arguing about international jurisdiction, and then in the past year, we were dealing with an administrative requirement that is barring this case from moving forward. So, in my view, we think it is the Taiwanese government's obligation to remove all these physical and legal barriers for foreign victims, and this is the one burning issue that the Taiwan NAP failed to address. Thank you.
Thanks, Shin Suan. It's ironic because the Taiwanese court is actually requiring the active cooperation of the Vietnamese authorities in order to recognize jurisdiction and the right of Taiwanese lawyers to represent the 7,800 victims. But this is happening at a time that Vietnam has embarked on one of the harshest human rights crackdowns in recent history, which means that stepping forward and trying to get the Vietnamese foreign ministry to approve such documents might doom the affected community, more members of the affected community, to jail. So it is it's an unreasonable barrier imposed by Taiwanese authorities. I'd like to move on to Vidya Dinka, who is president of the Indian Social Action Forum and a member of the Coordinating Committee of Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia and International Coordination International Coordinator of Taxation and Sustainable Finance Working Group of the C20, the Civil Society Forum to the G20, which is actually being held in Bali later this year. So Vidya, India is actually in its zero draft and you don't feel optimistic already. Why?
Because, well, it's understandable, right? We haven't really moved, very far. We could be the largest democracy of the world, but we are intrinsically a highly hierarchical society, and I do not think we have done enough work as a society to move forward from there. So we had this thing where the zamindar, the owner of the land, was in a sense king. And today, corporates are the owners of our land, of our crops, our grains, of 5G spectrum, of data, of everything, and also our governments in a way, because our whole election system has now gone into this almost US mode in terms of the amount of money that it requires, and therefore corporates really have quite a bit of control, which is why the zero draft is a very weak draft, because I cannot see our government actually pulling in and reining in corporates. I cannot see them monitoring, censoring, pushing corporates to do their due diligence, to do the right thing when it comes to human rights. So this dichotomy is built into the system, and whatever niceties we put into a draft, and remember the draft itself is not a very strong draft. It tells you what is, but it doesn't completely assess what we have on the ground. And what we have on the ground is communities fighting for their rights over their waters, over their natural resources, over their land. Somebody said we have a little more than 700 grassroots struggles against extractives and other kinds of taking over of people and communities and pollution across India. The figure might be really much more than that. So we have tremendous numbers of people affected. Have we sat down and talked to them? Have we done any baseline kind of work to understand even the laws that are supposed to protect them? How far are they protecting them until now? How have we done until now? That kind of work of studying the ground situation, coming up with some baseline data, and then also reviewing what do we have? We have the National Human Rights Commission that we could go to, or the state human rights commissions. But you go to them and they will tell you, oh, we can only take something where the state is an actor, So non-state actors, corporates, do not get covered by our human rights commissions. So therefore, where do people go when the corporate is the offender? Do they go to the state that is actually, somebody that works with corporates all the time? In fact, our present Prime Minister is a very, very honorable and a very powerful man, but he was propped up first, not even by his own political party, but by corporates as Modi for Prime Minister. It is only then it took about a year plus for his own party to accept him as their candidate. So here we have a head of state who was propped up by corporates. I don't think we can really expect anything from this draft. So forget about how powerful or meaningful or effective it will be when it actually is adopted. Second, of course, access to remedy is something we don't know. So implementation is going to be a problem. Intent is definitely a problem. And yes, access to remedy, far, far away.
Thank you, Vidya. So corporate capture of not just the process, but not just the NAP process, but the political process. Quite concerning. Our next up is Yutaro Ogawa, a lawyer from Tokyo and Secretary General of Human Rights Now. So as a lawyer, you're involved in a lot of litigation on labor and refugee issues, but you're also responsible for advocacy of human rights now on business and human rights issues. Ryutaro, Japan adopted a NAP in 2020. And when someone told me that the Indonesian NAP was a copy and paste of the Japanese NAP, people threw out their hands in horror. So what would be the burning issue or burning concern you have around Japan's NAP?
Thank you, Debbie. I must say to the Indonesian people, please stop the copy on the Japan NAP because it includes serious issues. Especially, my biggest concern is it lacks the analysis of the human rights risk, as she said. Because as you may know, the NAP, the essential role of NAP is to set the objectives based on the human rights abuses risk and the gap between the current legal systems. But in the Japanese NAP, there is no those analyses. So there is only what the government has done so far, and there is no any point out about the issue and what kind of risk is included in the current system. So this is maybe the essential, but maybe the most important issue of Japanese NAP. So I don't think implementation of NAP is also very problematic because we can't evaluate how far the NAP is proceeded without the gap analysis. There's no specific goals to be evaluated. So this is maybe that's why we need the mandatory human rights due diligence law and to declare the gap between the actual situation and the current legal system. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryutaro. So your systems analysis, you're basically looking at the systems analysis, and some of us are looking at the structure, and some of us looking at the fact that we were essentially sold out. Now, Shin-Young Chong is a full-time attorney at Advocates for Public Interest Law since 2012. So it's like, do we have to congratulate you on your 10-year anniversary? And she's been supporting victims of human trafficking and human rights violations by Korean companies, and is a member of the Korean Transnational Corporations Watch, KTNC Watch, which is one of the co-organizers. Now, Korea actually adopted a human rights national action plan firstly in 2007, and then added a chapter on business and human rights in 2018. But Shin-Young said, I don't want to talk about it. Partly because the Korean BHR chapter is very similar to the Japan's approach, which is basically saying we've done a lot of nice things and we don't have any specific objectives, and we don't really want to do anything, but we do want to show that we have an app. So I'm going to jump to the next question. So you're going to start with the next question, which is, if we consider mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence as the way forward, what would you prioritize in this mandatory framework? So, in other words, if you had a magic Harry Potter wand and you could create a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence framework, what's the first thing you're going to ask for?
Yeah, thank you, Debbie, for explaining the reason I am escaping from the question number one. So I don't think our net is comparable to other countries' net because it is not even an independent net on business and human rights. So bear with me that I start with the second question. So I'm sure you know that Korean companies are expanding all around the world through their supply chains. And like the industries that they are involved are also very diverse. So we have very big brands, electronics, manufacturing facilities are out there. And when they go with the suppliers. So you can imagine many, like hundreds of the facilities go abroad to produce the electronics. And also there are garment factories operated in many other countries other than Korea to supply the very famous Western brands mainly. And also we heard from my colleague here about the dam that was constructed by Korean company and also invested by Korean public financial institutions. So, and that's not the only dam actually. So we have other dams that are causing problems in many, many different countries. And also Korea is now, after like with this crisis that we are facing, Korean government is eager to secure the supply chain of raw materials, and they are involved with producing like thermals and even lithium for the solar panels and everything. So you can imagine like many different sectors with the different issues, but one thing they have common is that so far, as a network, KTNC Watch, we have trying to meet the various people in different countries to address these issues in Korea. But it was impossible for us to properly hold the companies accountable in anywhere in the world, let's say. So it was impossible in the outside of Korea and also impossible in Korea. And of course, in Korea, we have no legal basis to file the judicial cases, to proceed the judicial cases in Korea without any legal basis. But I think you've heard from my colleague yesterday mentioning about NCP issues. So as a member of OECD countries, we have this institution called National Contact Point. But we have filed numerous cases to NCP, but that was totally impossible, that they are not addressing the issue properly. So we realized that these all voluntary mechanisms, including NCP, these are not working. So now we need is a legal basis to hold the companies accountable for their misconduct that they are causing or involved in throughout their supply chains outside of Korea. So this is closely related to the access to remedy by the victims as well. Since we couldn't hold the companies accountable, it was also impossible for the victims to access remedy in anywhere in the world. So we believe that this is important. If we are going to have the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, it is crucial that we have the legal basis to hold the companies accountable with that legislation. So we see some developments in European countries, and it's quite concerning because some of the countries are missing to have that element. So without that element, we believe that will be like a tiger without teeth. So it's a toothless legislation. So we believe that it's the most important thing for us is to have the proper to be able to provide a ground for the hold the companies accountable and also enable the victims to access the remedy through the legislation.
Thanks, Shin-Yan. So there you have it. One of the first proposals is actually focusing on the extraterritorial obligations of the state to guarantee remedy to those subjected to human rights violations abroad by companies and their suppliers. I'm just going to move to Emily. In a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence framework, what would be your priority?
Thank you, Lily. Before I reply to the question, I just would like to, after hearing what my friend said from India, Japan, Korea and Taiwan, I do realize now why everybody is coming to Manushya asking, how did you get such a good nap? Because we did a national baseline assessment, but we did it on our own. It was not done by the government. And the government used our information to inform the NAP. They followed our priority areas on labor, extraterritorial obligations, on protection of human rights defenders, on environmental defenders and natural resources. But as we all said, since there's no clear implementation, there's no real will to have mandatory measures inside NAPs, we will never be able to access remedy. So if we are moving forward with the mandatory human rights regulations, which is what we all want, especially in Thailand, we actually, when we were working on the NAP, we actually produced very, very concrete comments for Thailand's NAP, which are comments that we can also use for what we want in a mandatory human rights due diligence in the country. And I'm showing you here. But what we are basically asking in terms of mandatory human rights regulations, the first thing is really to have meaningful consultation and meaningful engagement of affected communities and marginalized communities, especially indigenous people, and respect the FPIC, the free and prior informed consent. That's a priority, and as many speakers already said yesterday, FPIC is an ongoing process. It's not just at the beginning or at the end. It's throughout the supply chain, it's throughout the development of the project. So meaningful consultation of affected communities, not just a tick-the-box exercise, not just a stakeholders engagement exercise, but meaningful participation. And we understand that not everybody understands meaningful participation. That's why when it comes to mandatory human rights due diligence and the implementation of such legislation, it should also be undertaken by civil society and affected communities and led by them and not by an independent consulting firm that is going to serve the company, and that would most likely use list of participants as a way of community manipulation to show community consent. So it's really important to have meaningful consultation and also key actors to drive such consultation. Strong due diligence obligation aligned with the UNGPs, right? We are not reinventing the wheel. When we are looking at the next 10 years of the implementation of the UNGPs through mandatory human rights due diligence, we want such legislation to have strong DD obligation in line with the UNGPs, of course, throughout the full value chain with good definition of obligations. We also want an effective enforcement of such laws through administrative means, so an administrative body within the country that would oversee the implementation of the human rights due diligence legislation. We obviously want strong access to remedy. So as our friend from Korea already said, access to remedies is the key, should be a key element of such laws. So the responsibility of the company, the civil and criminal responsibility of the company is necessary. Although European countries are taking the lead in developing human rights due diligence legislation, some countries are failing and including such responsibility, like Norway or the Netherlands did not include, or Germany did not include the responsibility of the company. France did include the responsibility of the company in the human rights due diligence legislation. In terms of scope, we want all companies to be covered, including state-owned enterprise. So it's also a difference with other EU countries. Although France has the responsibility of the companies, it doesn't cover all companies. What we want in Thailand and what we want in Asia is that the scope of such legislation cover all companies inside and outside the countries to ensure that ETOs are also, extraterritorial obligations are also taken into consideration, including state-owned enterprise. And obviously, we also want to have a strong protection of human rights defenders and whistleblowers, because we know that this is a huge concern in our region. The proliferation of slap case, the proliferation of strategic lawsuit against public participation is real. Yesterday, human rights defenders from Thailand were sharing the case with the panelists, with the plenary sessions. We had a NAP. We didn't have any anti-slap measures in the NAP. We don't have an anti-slap legislation in the country. This is the reason why we need mandatory human rights due diligence, responsibility of the companies, including strong component on the protection of human rights defenders and protection of whistleblowers, because people should be able to hold companies to account. Thank you.
Thanks. Protection of human rights defenders and lawyers, but also anti-slap and a process that the whole, when we talk about, meaningful participation, this is like people saying, tell me to clean my room. It looks clean, but not by your standards. But also it reminds me of an exchange that we had in Geneva with some large companies where they actually said they felt disadvantaged by a voluntary framework because companies and states could pick and choose to what level they had to comply, and larger companies that chose to comply might actually be at a business disadvantage. So they felt that a mandatory regime gave companies certainty about compliance, but also ensured that as many companies as possible had to follow those rules, and it would level out the playing field. So it was interesting to see this business argument for a mandatory framework. Shin Suan, over to you. What would be your priority?
Well, I actually listed 3 items, but after hearing from Emily and Shin Yong, I felt like, okay, everything's been covered. So I'm just going to quickly go through it with a few comments. First of all, definitely cover beyond the company's own operations, so the supply chain, and also beyond the first tier suppliers. So if we want to go through the second tier, the third tier, which is often where abuses occur. And secondly, the accountability and remedy mechanism is crucial. We think this law must make clear that parent companies and the board is responsible to make sure that the due diligence process is updated regularly and takes into account the opinions from the affected communities and stakeholders. And lastly is, again, stakeholder engagement. What we're seeing in Taiwan is stakeholder communication and engagement is, in fact, a tick box exercise. It happens really late, usually after a decision is already made or a plan, a project has already been shaped. So when you come in at this point in time, you don't usually have the power to actually change the plan or the project. So that is very concerning. And lastly, this is not really an item I would prioritize, but rather a remark I would like to make. CSOs in Taiwan have been talking with our government about adopting a human rights environmental due diligence law. Now, it's been going on for months. Now, we are sensing inclination from our government to prioritize reporting over due diligence itself. So when we look at the UNGPs, we know that reporting, communicating publicly your commitment, your policies, and how you identify, assess, and address all these risks is critical. But we also know that it cannot be divorced from the actual due diligence and stakeholder communication and engagement. So we are concerned that if this is the direction we're heading in Taiwan, we might miss the opportunity to enact an effective human rights and due diligence law, and rather will have a so-called mandatory reporting law that couldn't really achieve what we really want. Thank you.
Thanks, Shin Suan. So, mandatory right to remedy, not just mandatory reporting.
Correct.
Okay, Vidya, over to you. Let's just trash the India NAP and move on to mandatory due diligence law, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. So you're drafting it. What's your first priority?
My first priority would be the marginalized in my own country. So remember that India has a large informal sector. And I think it really came home during the COVID pandemic. You all saw our informal workers trudging home, out of jobs, out of money, no social security to support them, some dying on the way home. And we've already forgotten them. The NAP never even addressed this, right? So if I was doing a NAP, somehow I would broad base the baseline.
Due diligence mandatory, no more NAP.
Yeah. So I would broad base the baseline, somehow bring informal workers into the consultations about what would work in terms of mandatory human rights, due diligence. We have, our securities board under financial reporting, they have this ESG markers that that companies are supposed to talk about and report on. So environment, social, safeguards, etc. But that's not mandatory. None of this is mandatory. Even the NAPs, the language is like kowtowing to corporates all the time. I think I have it down somewhere. And even as I find it, I must say that all the talk of NAPs is useless if you're not calling out the ease of doing business that large MDBs are pushing in our countries. What is the World Bank? What is the ADB? What is the IMF doing in South Asia? They are always pushing for business and ease of doing business in our countries. So our countries need to get their priorities straight. And I'm trying to find, yes, the language says creating awareness amongst businesses on the need to integrate human rights, like it's a fashion show, I don't know. The second chapter, which talks of corporate responsibility, states at the outset, given below is an overview of the government's expectations of socially responsible conduct from businesses. So definitely a mandatory form of moving forward needs to be instituted very, very, in a very short time, and we need to be very sharp on this. The other thing, not just the informal workers, because she said 3 points, I'm coming up with another. How do you how do we really rein in big business? Remember Mr. Adani, who is best friend of Mr. Modi. Crony capitalism is at its best in our country. So Mr. Adani, less than 24 hours ago, became for a brief period the second richest man in the world. He has been third richest man in the world for some time. How has he got rich? Support of the government, naturally, and also the kind of crazy schemes that governments have been lapping up. So like under the pretext of supplying poor Bangladesh with much needed energy, we are going to produce coal-fired energy, which is going to be sent to Bangladesh across a long transmission line, and then it enters Bangladesh. It's going to be more expensive than the power they already have. Two, it's going to be, they're already power surplus. It's no longer a poor Bangladesh now, especially in terms of energy. But we are going to be supplying it because Adani wants to make money, and there is a power purchase agreement, which means that the minute you have the capacity to produce, Bangladesh has to start paying Mr. Adani. But where is the coal of this environmentally disastrous plant coming from? It's coming from indigenous communities' lands. Where? In Queensland. And where is Queensland? Not in India. It's in Australia. So the coal is going to travel 8,000 odd kilometers and land in a port in Orissa state, and then again travel very many kilometers. I forget how much. I think 600 kilometers or something from Orissa into Jharkhand, where this plant is, where indigenous communities there have been resisting the takeover of their land, for which, of course, they've got a ton of cases against them that they're still fighting. In 2019, those indigenous groups went to the court against Adani's forceful acquisition of their land, of destroying their crops, their means of livelihood, etc. Well, the courts do not serve, the farmers and the fisher folk and the Adivasis, the Dalits and the tribals in India. So since 2009, the case is not even being heard. I go to senior lawyers saying, how can we move this case? And they laugh at me and say, are you crazy? It's Adani. This case will not move. If it moves, the judge is going to give you an adverse judgment. No problem, we'll bump it up to the Supreme Court. But they know this, right? So they will just see that it just lies buried. And the plant has come up. By end December, Adani says they will be able to transport power into Bangladesh. and the locals are completely destroyed, and their lives are being destroyed. So one is the mandatory whipping, so that corporates really get in shape and do what is necessary. Something that is not easy but must be done, and we have to work, I think, so hard for this. And the other is to somehow see that the informal workers of India are somehow protected, that micro, small and medium scale industries also come within the gambit of business and human rights legislation. Yeah.
Thanks. So informal sector and protection, having marginalized communities, including indigenous peoples, at the center of the legislation, including in the context of land and resource grabs. And in this case, this Adani guy has marvelously managed to oppress and abuse indigenous peoples in both India and Australia. Okay, Ritaro, what would you prioritize in a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence regime?
Oh yeah, I don't know, nothing to do with that. But in Japan, yeah, maybe the mandatory human rights due diligence law is to motivate the business person to prioritize more the human rights than the business merit. In terms of this, I think I also agree with the mandatory legal remedy and mandatory reporting is very important. And especially in Japan, I don't know in other countries, but when I have the dialogue with Japanese company, they tend to usually have such a dialogue. But in the dialogue, even we request the disclosure of what actually they do for the HLDD, they don't explain the specific information. So I think this is, I don't know, it's only or not, but this is, so maybe we should set a kind of mandatory of so stakeholder dialogue with the sufficient information disclosure. Otherwise, yeah, even we have many times of the dialogue, it's no worse. So, yeah. So.
Thanks. So we have an emphasis on extraterritorial obligations to guarantee right to remedy in the home state for those who have suffered human rights abuses elsewhere by companies and their suppliers, and that's very much going on. That's one of the. I think there's a general consensus on that. We're talking about meaningful participation of affected communities, and having. When we talk about meaningful participation, we're talking about a stakeholder process and a consultation process into the drafting of such legislation led by affected communities, which goes also to the need to prioritize and put marginalized communities at the center of the legislation. Not just having mandatory reporting, but actually having a meaningful stakeholder engagement, which both from Taiwan and Japan, not when we're talking about mandatory remedy and reporting and a stakeholder engagement, it means a dialogue with less tea and more actual information. So, it's a lot of these dialogues have a lot of tea but no information. So, which makes it difficult for affected communities to have an ongoing ability to make free, prior, and informed consent. So, this I hope gives everyone a snapshot of why the NAPs suck from our point of view. I'm not putting their word, and if you can quote me on saying the NAPs suck. You don't have to quote them on it because I don't want to embarrass any of you. But also what the priorities are, and which goes to the final question, and I'd like to wrap it up quickly so that people, there's more more attendees in the room than I expected. So if there are any questions, there's going to be time for Q&A. Quickly, if what are the next steps? I mean, all of us seem here at this table seem to agree that we do need mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence framework. Are any of you working on promoting this at national or regional level? And I'm going to Shenyang.
And so in fact, from KTNC Watch, we worked on mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. So we try to talk to the member of parliament to actually make this happen, but so far it seems far away. And one of the crucial issue for us is that even in Korea, among the civil society, this law it's not getting huge attention, in fact. And I guess
Not yet.
not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, so there could be many reasons, but I think it's so clear that so from yesterday we have been hearing the phrase that we need to put people first rather than profit. But I think it's something really difficult for everyone so far, and the value of this legislation is reflecting this core value that this is not about the profit. This is really about the people and environmental. And with this climate crisis that we are facing now, it's clear that we can't live like before. So we need a new type of legislation, new system to move from where we are standing right now. But currently, there's not huge consensus on that yet. So I think we need to work on that. And in addition to do that, I think it's really important to hear from the affected people outside of Korea, I think, because companies, they produce really nice sustainability reports. So if you just read the sustainability report produced by the company, and if you just see the commercials that they make, and you see the lives are beautiful. I mean, there's no problem at all, and they are doing such a beautiful things, and we don't understand what's the problem with that. So I think for us it's crucial to continue to hear from the ground, people who are affected by the company's activities. And my colleagues here, they have visited Laos before they came to Bangkok for the conference. So they wanted to hear from the local community who are affected by the collapse of the dam that Korean companies constructed. So we want to continue those type of activities, and I think it's important for us to continue to collaborate with you, work with you closely from this moment. So I think this is a really nice opportunity to talk about this together, and so that we can move forward from this point.
Maybe we need a K-drama on affected communities affected by business abuses of Korean companies, because that will not just raise awareness in Korea but pretty much the whole world. Anyway, no, but thank you, Shenyang. Emily.
All right, so at the national level in Thailand, I think everybody realized yesterday that we are pretty much aware that we don't want NAPs anymore. So we are moving forward with advocating for mandatory human rights due diligence. That's what we want, and that's what we're going to push for. But we cannot just do that just by saying it, right? Because as we know, countries and governments and companies would always challenge us by saying we don't have credible evidence. We don't have credible evidence of what we are saying. We're just screaming. So we actually produced a NAP assessment to showcase that the first NAP of Thailand hasn't had any impact, and that the implementation is very weak and the content is very weak, and we are launching it at the beginning of next month. And as a result of the NAP assessment that we are doing, at the same time we are producing comments to the second draft NAP of Thailand, because Thailand has produced a new NAP, without considering new emerging issues such as unpaid care work during COVID-19, such as tech and privacy, digital rights. So basically, we are building all the evidence to show companies and the government and the public that NAPs are useless because they are ineffective if there is a weak content to push for mandatory human rights due diligence. We're also going to lobby parliamentarians to push for such legislation because we're not waiting for the Thai government to do so. We can see they don't have the will. They're still stuck with the NAP and they're going to move forward with the second NAP. We're also worried with companies, especially the stock exchange of Thailand that is promoting mandatory reporting following ESG reporting standards. So that's also not what we want, because it's also being portrayed as like the first step of mandatory human rights due diligence, and that's very bad when the stock exchange of Thailand does that, when UNGP is promoting the STE of doing this, or the first step of HRDD in Thailand. Companies now will be reporting on ESG standards, and the reporting is mandatory. This is not mandatory human rights due diligence. So it's really important for us to build the capacity of communities on the ground that we're working with, for them to be very well aware of what constitutes a good HRDD. What do we want in the HRDD? And then we will push forward for what we want. Just like what we did with the NAP, but this time we're going to do it better because we're going to ignore the government, we're going to work directly with parliamentarians. At the regional level, we need to build solidarity. I think that's the first step what we're doing here by bringing people together from Southeast Asia and East Asia, especially because East Asian companies have a huge impact over what's happening in Thailand and in Laos and in Southeast Asia in general. We also work on Laos on the Laodem collapse, so that's definitely something that we need to push forward in terms of mandatory human rights due diligence. There's a concern that now UNGP is pushing the Lao government to do the NAP on BHR, So it's going to be the same story as in Thailand, like the fake illusion that companies will respect human rights. So we really need to build regional solidarity to push all of us for mandatory human rights due diligence in our countries, but not only that, to also encourage our countries to engage in the binding treaty. Because what we are asking in the mandatory human rights due diligence is nothing different from what we are asking at the international level when it comes to the binding treaty. So that's where now I'm moving to the international level advocacy. We can use some cases that is happening in our countries, or we can use some cases that companies are doing from our countries to push for mandatory human rights due diligence. Like our Korean friends are using the Laodem collapse, the fact that Korean development companies have a huge impact in Laos to push for HRDD in Korea. Just like in Thailand, we are using what was happening with Kingsgate, an Australian company having negative environmental and human rights impact due to their mining operations on communities on the ground, to push for HRDD in Australia, but also to push for HRDD in Thailand. So using specific cases of harms and rights violation and environmental impact can also build solidarity across borders, like us working with Australian NGOs or us working with Korean NGOs to bring HRDD back in our countries, but also really pushing the binding treaty agenda, because at the end of the day, what we want in mandatory human rights due diligence is also what we are asking in the binding treaty. But we want the legislation first, because we know that the binding treaty is going to take more time. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Now, some people have already mentioned ESG ratings, and actually earlier this year, Inclusive Development International and ASEAN issued a report which found that a number of companies with high ESG ratings actually had business relationships and were paying revenues to entities controlled by the brutal and illegal military junta in Burma, which is actually using those resources to inflict war crimes or crimes against humanity on civilians. So ESG is not necessarily the holy grail here. Now, Shin Swan, you said that civil society were already talking to the government about mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws. So what are the next steps for you at national, because Taiwan is a country, and national and regional level?
Awesome, thank you, Debbie. So the overarching goal nationally is for sure to implement a mandatory human rights environmental due diligence law. Now what we're doing, I would say there are 3 layers. So first of all, to build capacity among the public. The idea that we should demand human rights due diligence is not widely understood and informed among the public. So we're organizing monthly seminars to talk to people about the law itself, as well as individual cases like Emily and Xingyong have both mentioned. For instance, we talk about the Formosa case. We also talk about forced labor issues in Taiwan's fishing sector, which is also a big deal. So we're trying to build momentum for when the time comes for the passage of this law among the public, because our government cares a lot, our lawmakers and the government, they both care a lot about public opinion. And then the second layer, I would say, is the lawmakers. So you might be surprised, but also our lawmakers are not familiar with due diligence law. So through our dialogue with them, we're trying to, I wouldn't say teach, but let them know the global trends and what we're looking at, what we want from a mandatory due diligence law. And then at the government, the third layer would be the government level. So this December would be the second anniversary of our NAP, of the launch of our NAP. And we want our government to commit to enacting a mandatory environmental due diligence law in December. We are not particularly optimistic, but we're trying really hard. So this brings me to the regional solidarity. I think regional pressure is a really, really important pressure point for our government. So if we can build alliance and talk to our governments collectively and individually, I think it would be really helpful in pushing such a law in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thanks, Shin-Suan. Vidya.
Yeah. So, what will we do in this scenario? This is a question which I think most CSOs and grassroots movements on the ground need to grapple with. Are we going to waste our time on the napping nap? When at best it'll be like a guideline or the government sort of being nice as usual to the corporate, saying, please do this. What is the point of us continuing about the NAP? And therefore, I think INSAF is very keen to follow what we as the Asia Task Force are promoting and pushing for, which is a legally binding instrument. So that's one. The other thing is, finally, it is member groups of ours and others across India that may be affiliated to a larger group or are just fighting their own little struggle on the land, in the tea gardens, on the beaches, whatever. So, and we must sort of zoom out and also remember that the COVID-19 pandemic was really a pandemic for the laws in India that protected human rights and the environment. All our labor codes, our environmental protection, our Land Acquisition Act, our Forest Rights Act, all of it has got watered down. So the NAP in India right now talks of all the legislations, etc., and the right to environment that the Supreme Court of India has been talking about. But how does it translate that for communities and people on the ground? And the fact that many CSOs who are specialized in UN processes are really not like the CSOs that Emily represents here. In our country, they want to cozy up. And they want to bring in a new kind of nice, genteel system where it'll be, more certification, more goody-goody, more CSR. That does not translate into mandatory human rights, basic due diligence, etc. So I think groups like INSAF are very clear. We are going to be with the people on the ground, fighting the good or the bad fight, but we will be out there, not so much in these spaces. These spaces need to be engaged in by groups like us so that we can bring that power from the streets onto the diocese. But mostly our time is going to be spent really on the streets and the maidans and shouting out slogans and fighting the good fight. That is our focus. And of course, as Asian Task Force, please read the flyer that we've sent around. We need a legally binding instrument right now, not tomorrow, but right now. Yeah.
Thank you, Vidya. Ryutaro.
Yes. I totally agree with we need regional solidarity for the mandatory human rights HRDD, and that is why I came here today. So I'd like to make a strong solidarity with us, all of them today. And but let me talk about Japan. Maybe some of you may know Japan released human rights due diligence guideline in the last week, which is the voluntary standard. And actually there was not enough chance for CSOs to commit the procedures, so we actually make argumented request stakeholder engagement for the implementation at least. And the guideline, especially remedy part is very poor, so I don't think it's so good instrument. But at least about the scope of the HRDD is very huge. I don't know why. In the guideline, the scope of the human rights issues and the scope of the size of the company and the scope of the supply chain is almost all. So, or we can use this guideline to advocate to the company from now about almost every issue. Maybe we can set the table. So I don't know what kind of answer will be made from the company, but if the company say, this is only the guideline and no legal bindings, maybe we can correct such answers, negative answers, and to use those answers as a legislative fact for the mandatory human rights due diligence. So maybe in terms of this, as a person said, it is important to correct such human rights issues in the other countries. And please let me know, especially relating to Japanese company. Then I can negotiate with the Japanese company based on this voluntary guideline, and maybe I can use this for the mandatory human rights HRDD law. Yeah.
Thank you, Tara. So what we have is starting with the grassroots, being out in the streets, raising awareness and understanding that mandatory human rights and environment due diligence law may not necessarily be the silver bullet, but it actually is a very important part of the toolkit and a very necessary part of the toolkit. It means also leveraging some of the less dangerous guidelines, so from the more useful guidelines like the human rights due diligence guidelines, leveraging that in order to engage with companies and trying to push that line further. It means dealing, quite interestingly, going after the lawmakers and raising awareness amongst them and getting their commitments. So we see that working with bureaucrats is kind of like off the table because it's been so much of a delaying process. And raising public awareness, but also part of that is connecting affected communities overseas with stakeholders in the home state, so that, and it's also another way of creating more momentum, of ensuring that affected communities know they're not alone in this, but also creating a sense of responsibility and obligation amongst diverse stakeholders in the home state. And of course, in that process too, we're all working together in both the regional and international spaces, whether we are campaigning for a legally binding instrument over the drafting of the LBI in Geneva, or whether we are working together here regionally. So there's been a lot of solidarity in the room, and that's been actually hugely different from my previous experiences in the Asia Business and Human Rights Forum, that there has been a huge amount of solidarity in the past 2 days. And so I feel very optimistic about this. And what's made me even more optimistic is the fact that we actually have 28 minutes for Q&A. So raise your hand, I'll acknowledge you, introduce yourself. You're going to have to use one of these microphones. So don't be shy, we made the time. Yes, but here and here. Come over to a microphone.
Hi Debbie, my name is M. Ravi. I'm a human rights lawyer from Singapore. And
They let you out of the country, huh?
and also ESG practitioner. But you know, I understand about the ESG bit that you are talking about, which is often massaged. Acupuncture points are here. So I'm actually struggling between, because I'm also doing some impact investment advice and fund. But and I have in my team mostly public interest lawyers in that, and I selected them because of the contribution they can make. The question that I have actually is about Singapore. I find it's very disturbing, and I don't get the answers in Singapore definitely, because that's the reason why I have to come, and of course I got the permit to leave. Permission to leave because of the passport issues. But I'm still trying to find out whether is there really a national action plan in Singapore, which I got the answer from an Indonesian UNDP colleague as no. And I'm also trying to find out as to whether, of course, I also have a law firm in Myanmar, and I understand the constraints there. Like, for example, the British diplomat Vicky Bowman, who did the work on responsible business, that even in Myanmar there is a non-state actor initiative. Is there one in Singapore, a representative, like for example, non-state actor, or National Action Plan is out, but no, where is probably a gongo is hiding somewhere, I'm not sure. Government organized NGO. Yeah. No, I don't want to, they will sue me for defamation. But what I'm saying is that I find it very disturbing, especially, this voice from Singapore must be heard.
Yeah.
It's a small island which has huge power in the region. Because I'm saying this out of due respect for the people. The people have little role in, how much I know about this, Debbie, because you have worked on all this civil society issues for many years. Because all the impact funds are parked in Singapore. Singapore is promoted as a regional hub for ESG business. I'm not sure whether business and human rights. I'm not sure whether when we are going to even, whilst we are having a nap here or a nap, I know it's after lunch, or during lunch or after lunch. But the thing is but the problem is that I find that the overemphasis on regulatory nature of ESG undermines the people's voice, especially in Singapore. And it puts people even more danger when, for example, if they engage unwittingly in, for example, corruption in Vietnam, and you say that you want to have impact investment from Singapore as a vehicle companies in Vietnam, then Singapore employees who are employed, and if they close one eye on the corruption, then they can be prosecuted in Singapore. So it puts the workers, especially Singaporean workers, in a lot of vulnerability. And I can say a host of issues, but I just feel that the Singapore people have been reduced to just economic digits. They're the most stressed out workers in the world. They are the least happy. And I think that at the altar of this so-called ESG, their human voice should not be suppressed, and the region must know this.
Thank you. So, it is kind of ironic that Singapore is rich in money and poor in information disclosure, and that you had to come all the way to Bangkok.
By the way, you're on Facebook
out.
Live from Singapore.
I don't care. I'm banned in Singapore anyway. But this is quite an issue, and I think in some ways, Vidya also raised this question of multilateral banks, the multilateral development banks, about financing. And Singapore is a finance hub and a capital hub. And it has not been held accountable, and it's been very lacking in transparency, not just for people outside the country, but people in the country. And putting people in double jeopardy in order to make money. Jeopardy in Singapore and jeopardy in the host state like Vietnam is actually quite, it's unconscionable and irresponsible. And I work on Burma, so Singapore is one of the biggest sources of investment. And the dictators are suspected of parking all their funds in Singapore anyway. So I think Singapore is a nut that needs to be cracked. Don't worry, all of us you're not unaware of what's going on. So thanks for your intervention. I had a hand here.
Hi, so I am Pooja. I am from India, and I'm from Oxfam. So while we are talking about the Indian NAP, one of the important challenges that we have been facing on the ground is really on the transparency, because when we talk to the workers on the ground, we actually do not know, even the workers do not know as to who are the companies who are procuring. So when we are talking about NAP, it must be really important to emphasize on the disclosures. And many times we have seen that a disclosure on the supplier list is really, really helpful. My second point would be basically even when there is disclosure on the suppliers, and when we are talking about a legally binding instrument, many times the legal processes can be very, very unending. So there has to be a time frame in terms of how much time should be there in terms of the redressal processes. And one of the things that Indian NAP does take into consideration is that it does take into consideration the public companies, but it's very vague. So it has to be taken into consideration as well. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Actually, so we're not just talking about NAP, but also about the mandatory due diligence regime. That there has to be transparency, that this is a part of the mandatory regime, and a clear time frame for remedy. Yeah, there's been horror stories about people, some of the few people who were able to put the case to court, and basically they were either dead or they had actually advanced in years and brought in the next generation before they could get any remedy. And going back to the country, Ecuador, the case of Ecuador versus Chevron, where the community has been dealing with the shit in their community, the pollution, for more than 3 decades already, and still not getting remedy, even though they might even have the state on their side in this case. And this is why at the international, regional, and national level, we do need some kind of mandatory framework. Any other hands? Yes, or Ray and sorry, yeah, Ray first, and then sorry, I know you need.
There's one more here. And there's one more.
I'm sorry. I'm Ray-Chen Zhenzhong from Taiwan, and with several trade unions and labor organizations. So this is a question to Xinyao and Awasang, but if there are responses from other speakers, are also welcome. So I suppose that in this room we all agree that HRBD legislation is very important. So I would like to ask question further that what or where is the political opportunity to have that kind of act related? For example, in Taiwan, our government released our NAP because of the friendly suggestion from the European Union. Okay, so and it looks like that Taiwan as U.S. government is going to have an FTA probably pretty soon. So it will be another political opportunity. But as a grassroots union organizer, those political opportunities for our Western friends are not so pleasant, So I suppose that for the situation in East Asia countries, it's quite similar. So yes, so please for South Korea, for Japan, and so what is the political opportunity? So especially if there are some opportunity within your country or from domestically, not purely internationally. Yes,
Okay.
please.
Ritaro has been the last one answering all of my questions, so now you're the first. And then Shina.
Okay, thank you for the question. The political chance opportunity for the mandatory humanitarian HRDDs. I think now, now is a kind of chance for Japan because Prime Minister Kishida, he is interested in the human rights diplomacy, and he or I don't know who, but in the political party of the Kishida, they made some human rights diplomacy committee, and by the recommendation by that committee, they mention about the legislation for HRDD. So we can maybe use this momentum, and also I think the important is, as you say, the Biden administration, the US. I think between term of the Biden administration, we should put this momentum as much as we can, because he is obviously interested in the human rights situations especially in Asia these days.
Janelle?
I wish I have a perfect answer for you, but then it's really difficult, as you can guess. I mean, we wish we had a magical pressure point that things can work out, but unfortunately, I don't think there's such a thing. But still, I think it's good to know that at least Japan has a good momentum right now, because it matters for Korea what Japanese government has to do, will do. So I think just looking around other countries, it's important to see what other countries are doing. But at the same time, I think for our network, we have been very honest. I mean, we should have been thinking more strategically in a way that what can be the best way to achieve the goal, but we haven't been able to do that. We have been just doing the same thing, trying to find the cases abroad and then trying to bring those stories to the Korea. And I think those are the important things as well, because I mean, opportunities will come somehow, I think. And currently, political situation in Korea is quite difficult due to after the change of the government. I mean, they try to. I mean, they hate everything about regulating companies and want to secure supply chain in other ways that we think. So it's not an easy moment, but at the same time, people are noticing more danger, risks of the climate crisis. The movement in Korea people do care about climate crisis, and there's a huge movement on that. So we believe that we need to address this issue in terms of climate crisis as well, because corporations are the ones that are causing the largest problems. So there could be one opportunity, but at the same time, we need to focus on the things that we have been doing so far. We want to continue to address those situations, bad things happening all the time. Korean companies, and nonetheless, they say whatever they say, we don't believe them. They are causing problems all the time everywhere. So we will continue to find the cases, and we will continue to talk to the affected people, and we will continue to bring the cases to Korea.
Thanks. Indra, sorry, we're gonna have to look. Sorry, I didn't. Thank you for whoever pointed out that we have participants asking questions, because I don't have eyes in the back of my head. Yeah.
Not yet.
Thank you. My name is Indras Ghosh. I'm with the Indo-German Chamber of Commerce. Our organization does represent about 4,000 Indian and German companies. Of course, today I'm not representing them. I don't have a question, but perhaps I would like to offer a few of my own experience to give broader perspective. Actually, in my work, it's been the private sector is the one who is more willing to adopt human rights due diligence, supply chain due diligence. We do a lot of work in the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, a mandatory due diligence legal framework is coming in the next year. in January, and we are preparing German companies in India to comply to those. Within those work, we try really hard to understand what is the issue here. It's not like they don't want to do this, but there were essentially several bottlenecks. Just to highlight a few, is that number one is the awareness. It's very lacking. People who would do the due diligence themselves do not know the difference between CSR and human rights, and that's already an issue. You spoke about the BRSR framework, I believe, the business reporting and sustainability reporting, and this is why it has two versions, one mandatory and the next is voluntary, BRSR Light. And I think to address that awareness needs to be a part of the NAP. I truly believe that. Because those workers, if you get to know them, they are also from the local community and they do care about it. The next one is we need to address the complexity of the sustainability certification itself. There are different certifications that would address forced labor, and you have a separate one that address responsible agricultural practices. Where does the due diligence sit, and would those certifications be enough to answer the due diligence? We need to make it simple, maybe consolidate, bring those things together, because the burden would really be lessened, and therefore you have a much lower barrier to comply to the diligence for the companies. I also would like to end where you ended, optimistic. Again, coming back to the German, the way they do it, they had an NAP, which is voluntary for a period of 2-year monitoring, and they found that only around 16% of companies are within the adequate standard that they have set. Subsequent to that, they have enacted the legal framework, a mandatory one, and then I believe later this year, if not next year, they're coming up with updated NAP as well. So I know there are a lot of challenges here, a lot of things that needs to be addressed, but I believe this is a journey on itself. The NAP is not the end. There will be an updated one. They will be going into a mandatory one. And I would ask all of you to have businesses also in the dialogue and understand what is the challenge, because it's not like they don't want to do it. Maybe there are the reasons that has not been considered.
Thanks. Our gentleman over there, sorry I didn't get your name.
Okay, my name is Java from Cambodia. So my question is just like, let me try to go straight. I just really want to know what exactly the root cause, the problem with this NAP implementation and development here. As I heard your experience of your perspective experience of this NAP development and implementation. So is it the problem of NAP itself, or the problem of the implementation, the development process? And do we have any other alternative approach instead of shifting from not having NAP to do this human rights religion mandatory? Or can we do some work in a compromise way in between? How can we improve those NAP in a way? Because we know, even though we have many others legal binding, the government can still play around within that. So are there any alternative way that we can think through, we use the existing one that we have, how to improve, how to make it better, just like that?
May I?
Okay, look, we're running out, we have actually run out of time. I was over optimistic, but I think Vidya and Emily feel very motivated to answer this.
Thank you. And we're starting the diplomatic briefing on the legally binding instrument in this room immediately after, and I'm moderating that too. So
good transition. No, thank you very much for your question. I think we tried two systems at the same time. We tried in Thailand, and that's the reason why we are here. That's the reason why we are coming in numbers with affected communities. It does not work. Even though we have a very good process because we led the process and we were using the process, the content is weak and there's no clear implementation. So NAPs are meant as they're like greenwashing tools for governments, if you want, and also greenwashing tools for companies to say that they want to engage in business and human rights. This is the very reason why we are here advocating for mandatory human rights due diligence, and why we want countries to engage in the legally binding instrument on business and human rights. Because voluntary measures alone are not bringing any change. We tried, it's been 5 years, we have a second draft NAP that is exactly the same thing as the first NAP. We don't see any change. And you know, Thailand is a little bit more in advance than Cambodia, so look at our example and look at how it failed. Look at how it failed. Like, you heard communities yesterday. So really, like, we really need to build solidarity and push all of our countries in the region for mandatory measures and engaging in the legally binding instrument, because NAPs alone are not going to bring change.
Vidya?
So I agree with her. NAPs can be like a really slow starting point. But when you talk of, for example, a country like India, how do you implement it all the way across the country at the local level, at the panchayat, which is the village level, because that is where companies are being set up, manufacturing units are being set up. How do you see that they keep to environmental norms? They don't even keep to our legislated laws on environment, or, you know, basic things. You know, your supply chain will have child labor, etc. So this is something that the present NAPS is not even thinking of. Forget about things that came up, you know, about illicit financial flows, etc. They're not even thinking of this. So our NAPS is such a weak document. I frankly think we should trash it. I don't think we should labor with it anymore. We are saying it has to be mandatory. You need to make that shift. Let's not, you know, work with something that will ultimately not work. As a guideline, it cannot be implemented effectively, at least in my country. I know it cannot be implemented effectively in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, maybe in Sri Lanka. I don't know how the present circumstance will work out. But basically, I think there's such a gap in terms of even understanding the situation on the ground, that if you do not base your whole premise on understanding and then designing for effective implementation, you're going to come up with nothing. So it is the LBI that we now are putting our strength behind, and let's hope it comes through.
Okay, we are at the end. We are 4 minutes over time. Indra, thank you for coming and sharing some of those complexities, but one of the issues is that a mandatory regime then implies a much stronger commitment by the authorities to raise awareness and ensure compliance. And that's actually what most communities need. Now, to quote someone who said the NAP was a first step, I actually, for human rights defenders, including our Thai human rights defenders, it was the first tab. So on that point, it's time for something that's binding. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to our co-organizers. We're now going to start the briefing on the legally binding instrument. So anyone who's waiting outside, please come in. You're warmly welcome. And as compensation for losing 5 minutes of your time, come help yourself to candy.